All right, folks. Once again, I am going to welcome you to another Wildlife for You online wildlife class. This is 2022. It's the first class of the year, hopefully one of many, many more, at least 24 more or 23 more. But today's class is going to be a relatively simple, basic class, but it's one that I hope you all will love, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about the three bears. And when I say the three bears, we're not talking about childhood fairy tale stories. We're going to be talking about the three species of bears that are found in North America. And I will be one of the lead presenters. My name is Daryl Radijek, like I said. I also have my co-host, Stephanie Payne, who is also available on the video screen here. We'll be talking about these three bears, these three North American bear species. And you all know our background. We are wildlife biologists and large carnivore specialists. So the information we're presenting to you is pretty much science-based information that we will put up against any other information that you find out there. So with that, let's get started on tonight's presentation. So I mentioned we're going to be talking about the three bear species of North America. And so what are those three bear species? Well, the big one that most people are very aware of is this bear right here. Its scientific name is Ursus americanus. This is the American black bear. This is what the vast majority of folks in North America are familiar with. But there are two other species that we're also going to be talking about because they are found in North America. The first one of these other species is this one. It's the brown bear. And their scientific name is Ursus arctos. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that. But besides the black bear, we have the brown bear. And then there's that third species that not many people will ever get to experience it, but you might see it in a zoo here or there. It's our third North American species of bears, and it is the polar bear. The scientific name, Ursus maritimus. So these are the three species of bears that are found in North America. And right off the bat, I'm wondering, or I'm hoping that there's someone out there thinking, oh, Daryl, you left something out, because what about grizzlies? Well, the thing is, folks, grizzlies, believe it or not, are the same species of bears. They're brown bears. They are Ursus arctos. And so some people will hear the bear called a brown bear. Some people will hear it called a grizzly bear. Some people call it Kodiak bear. A lot of that all depends on where they see this brown bear in North America. And we're going to go into much more detail about the differences between those. But just know that they are all brown bears, Ursus arctos. That's that big, whenever we're talking about grizzlies, that is the bear species we are talking about. So to kick things off here, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the bear range. And what I mean by that is, where in North America do you find these three species of bears? And we'll first start off talking about the black bear, because like I said, most people in North America are familiar with black bears. Now, if you were to go back in time, and say you go back in time prior to Europeans ever landing in North America, so depending on how long ago that was, but say we go back in time about 500 years ago, and we look to see where black bears were found in North America, this is what we'd see. You'd see that black bears were pretty much found almost everywhere. You didn't see them in the Arctic areas, and there was a couple of patches in the southwest and way down south in Mexico, but the black bear range did extend down, way down into Mexico as well, but they were found all over North America. But as most people know, I shouldn't say humans, Europeans didn't like to compete with other animals, and we unfortunately started exploiting them. We started using them, we were hunting them a lot for food, but a lot of times, especially with these large predator type animals, we didn't want to compete with them. We didn't want we were fearful of them for one thing, but we also didn't want them getting our livestock or anything like that. And so unfortunately, Europeans really put a dent in the black bear range in North America. And this is typically where you find them in North America today. This is their current range. Now, I will tell you, I do want to do a little spiel about range maps. This is obviously drawn in as close as we could get it. Understand, there is no government body called www.wildliferangemaps.com where everything is up to date. And the reason I'm bringing this up is we talk about animal ranges all the time. One of my favorite animals, the cougar, is often it's often misunderstood where you find cougars. And we'll put up range maps and people are constantly picking them apart because they're not drawn perfect. You have to understand these range maps often don't get updated, but every 10 years or so, depends on who's updating them. So whenever you see a range map of any animal species, no matter what it is, take it with a grain of salt, just use it as a generality. This is generally where you find those species. So the periphery on range maps often changes because guess what, folks? Animals move, they expand their territories. And so range maps can change over time and sometimes they're not updated. So whenever you see a range map, just know this is generally where you find these animals. And so this map that you're looking at here is generally where we find black bears. Now you see, obviously, all across the Canadian, all across Canada, and a large part of the lower 48 states will find black bears. If you notice where they're found mostly, though, it's in mountain ranges. Primarily because humans really haven't developed the mountain ranges. All the lowlands humans developed and they kind of kept bears at bay. But that's generally where you found those bears in mountain ranges. It's not like they preferred the mountains over the plains. They would gladly live in the plains, but that's where the people were and the people didn't tolerate them. So anyway, black bears have a tremendous range in North America. If you look at the population of them, you're looking at anywhere from 500,000 black bears all the way up to 800,000. Lots and lots of black bears. So their population is doing absolutely wonderful. So how about, I got to find Stephanie to unmute her because she apparently decided to mute herself. Okay. I was wondering if Stephanie was going to chime in with any tidbit.
I was trying to. I put it in the chat. Yeah. Don't forget also that we do see circumstances with different species, not just bears. Specifically cougars, we hear this a lot, but even with, for example, Bruno the wandering bear, if you do find cases where an individual animal may be on walkabout, one animal does not a population make. So that is very important. Daryl, can you do your mouse? Because we can see your mouse. Can you show about where Bruno walked from where to where?
Yeah, came out of northern Wisconsin, which would be up here, and walked all the way down. If you keep following, it was actually following the Mississippi River and ended up in northern Louisiana. And Stephanie, you made such a wonderful post because especially when you're talking about cougars, range maps are based typically on breeding populations where they have documented the animal breeding, producing babies, and staying year round. And so that's why those range, someone will say, oh, there was a bear sighted in somewhere in Iowa. How come Iowa's not? Well, until you have a breeding population, they tend not to put it on the map. So thank you for that tidbit, Stephanie. Okay, moving on, we'll talk about a little bit about the range of the brown bear. And so brown bears, once again, you come to North America prior to the European settlement, and you are going to find brown bears in lots and lots of areas. In fact, if you look at it, they inhabited most of the western half of North America. And so if you read chronicles of the Lewis and Clark expeditions when they're going through the plains, there was a lot of brown bears that were encountered in the plains as one of the more feared animals that they encountered, but they were pretty much all the way from the northern parts of Canada, ranging all the way down into Mexico and everything pretty much west of the Mississippi River. So huge range for brown bears. But once again, humans or the Europeans weren't very tolerant of this large apex predator on the landscape. And so the range was pretty much shrunken tremendously until what you see here today in red. Now you do see that finger extending down into the lower 48 states. That is the current grizzly bear range in the US outside of Alaska in the lower 48. And that little piece that hangs off there is that greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And then that brown bear population extends up that Rocky Mountain, the continental Rockies, and it shoots all the way up into the Yukon, into Alaska. So this is the current range of brown bears in North America. Now, I will tell you, population-wise, they're doing pretty well in North America. We're estimating anywhere between 50,000 to 80,000 brown bears. So only about a tenth of the number of brown bears as compared to black bears, but their population is doing really well with that many animals. Now, Stephanie, do you happen to know what the worldwide population of brown bears is?
Yeah, it's upwards of around 200,000.
And most of those folks would be found in Eurasia. Russia has a huge brown bear population. And the term for that is, what is it,
circumpolar, but they're not circumpolar. Yeah. I'm thinking polar, sorry.
Anyway, they're found throughout the northern hemisphere. So not just North America, but Eurasia. Brown bears are a very widespread, wide-ranging animal, and there's about 200,000 of them. So the reason I'm bringing this up, folks, is you will often hear about the brown bears or the grizzly bears in Yellowstone being endangered. And it gives this false impression that the grizzly bears are an endangered species, that they're in fear of going extinct. And that is not the case. What we're talking about with those Yellowstone grizzlies or brown bears, that is a subpopulation. Yes, those brown bears in that greater Yellowstone area dropped to perilously low numbers. They estimated just over 100. Now they're back up to at least 700. Some believe it may be as high as 1,000. But those bears in that area were endangered, but grizzly bears or brown bears in general were not endangered. So just wanted to be specific about that. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to look at the range for polar bears. Now, again, coming to North America prior to the European settlement, this is where you would find polar bears in North America. And you see, it's pretty much that whole Arctic Circle area. Now, after the Europeans arrived, here's what happened to the polar bear range. You can see it really didn't move much. That is because humans don't like living in the Arctic. And so there's not that many humans in the Arctic. And so their range has not shrunk all that much because there wasn't humans that were really fighting with them. Obviously, there's going to be some Native American tribes up there that have coexisted with them for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but the polar bear range has not shrunk all that much. Now, understand one of the biggest threats that we've got going on now is climate change. And a big thing is with a warming climate, we're losing some of that sea ice, and polar bears are heavily dependent on that sea ice. So there is concern with polar bears in that their habitat is dwindling because their habitat oftentimes involves being on sea ice to hunt their favorite animals. But for the most part, polar bear range hasn't been impacted too much by humans other than climate change. So, okay, those were all three bear ranges. Let's throw them on top of each other to see where we find them. So real quickly, just so you can see everything all at once, there's a black bear range, pretty much all or many places in North America. Brown bear range up in the Alaska, Yukon, northwestern area, Canada, and then the polar bear, obviously, in the more Arctic situations. And so if you live anywhere in the lower 48, odds are you're going to be dealing with or be most familiar with black bears. If you're in some of those western states, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and even some western parts of Washington now, they're starting to have some pretty good brown bear populations, which is a great thing. And unless you're living in the far north, you're probably not going to be dealing with polar bears all too much. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but there's oftentimes a question, well, if those animals were there in that area historically, why don't you reintroduce them? And we've done that with many animals, with deer and elk and turkeys. The early Europeans wiped a lot of those species out or extirpated them. They kind of cleaned them out from the areas that they originally lived. But then game agencies came in and restored those populations. They restored deer, they restored elk and turkey, and a lot of those other big game animals. How come bears aren't being reintroduced? The thing is, apex predators, and bears are considered an apex predator. They're kind of the top of that food chain out there. It's a, Steph, you could jump in if you want, but it's a very difficult discussion to have with the public. And a lot of it has to do with, I hate to say it, but the public, by and large, don't really like the idea of apex predators in their backyard. They like the idea of having bears in the wild, but when it comes to having them in their backyard, they kind of lose that pizzazz. Anything you want to add there, Steph? Because you were involved with some cougar stuff, haven't you been?
Yeah, and it's very much like what Daryl said. It's not that they don't want the animals on the landscape, they just don't want them super close and on the landscape for the most part. But it is a very polarized discussion because you have a lot of very vocal people on both opposite ends of the spectrum, as we see a lot in today's era. So the problem is when you have a very large group that are against something and a very large group that are for something, finding that middle ground and then getting the government support to then make something into an actual accomplishable thing, those are difficult.
Yeah, and it's real easy to think about, because if you're a state agency or wildlife agency and you come to the public and say, hey, we're going to bring back deer, or we're going to bring back turkey, we're going to bring back this cute cuddly animal, everybody's on board. But when you mention an apex predator, whether it be a wolf or a bear or a cougar, there is going to be a contingency that's like, what are you, nuts? You can't bring those back. So reintroduction of bears into their former range isn't going to happen. However, now that I just said that, I will tell you that there was a little experiment, and it might have happened in other states, but back in Tennessee, we were trying to reintroduce bears into the Cumberland Plateau, and this was in the early 1990s. I actually had a little bit of a hand in that. It was kind of neat because we're trying to move bears across from the Appalachian Mountains over a big valley and into the Cumberland Mountains, or the Cumberland Plateau. And when we first started that little project, we would capture bears from the mountains, move them about 50 or 70 air miles away, and we would release them. And guess what? The bears just walked right back home. And they kept doing that. No matter if we released a male or a female, they would just walk right back home. So then we tried putting them in acclimation cages, waited a little bit, then we opened the door and they walked back to the mountains. And then it wasn't until finally we realized, you know what, if we want to reestablish bear populations, let's move some of the bears in the middle of winter when they're hibernating. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But what we do is we'd move these pregnant females that were going to be giving birth soon, and we'd put them in an artificial den where we wanted them, and the females would give birth. And once they gave birth, their motherly instinct kind of overrode their homing instinct. And so they would stick around to care for the cubs. And by sticking around caring for the cubs, they had established that new home range. So anyway, that was a neat little project that kind of flew under the radar there for a little while. It wasn't a covert operation. People knew about it, but it wasn't well known. So anyway, bear reintroduction is not going to be taking place anywhere in North America anytime soon. Fortunately, because bear populations are doing wonderful. They're expanding in most places, so we're going to let nature take its course. And Steph, if you can monitor, can you see the chat box?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been on it. No
Yeah, I'm not going to bother reading it. If there's anything you need me to answer and you want to chime in, just go ahead and chime in. So, okay, moving on. Okay, this is where I get nerdy because I'm a wildlife biologist and I love biology, and I don't care if I'm a nerd, but we're going to talk a little bit about bear biology and what separates one species from the next species. And so to jump right in here, let's talk a little bit about the physical characteristics of these three different species. And again, we're going to be talking about black bears, we're going to be talking about brown bears, and we're going to talk about polar bears. Now, there's some drastic differences between these three species. So first and foremost, let's first off start talking about weight and how big these bear species actually are. And obviously, we're going to be talking about ranges, not geographic ranges, but weight ranges. So when you look at a black bear, which is what species of bears most people are familiar with, black bears tend to be anywhere, you have a male black bear anywhere between 200 to 500 pounds. Females, a little bit smaller, maybe 150 to 300 pounds. Now, right off the bat, I will tell you a 500-pound wild black bear is rare. Most of those adult males are going to be in that 200. If they're really healthy, they'll be in that 300-pound weight range. You have to understand they're eating a diet of natural foods. So whenever you see that roly-poly black bear that can barely walk because he's so fat, he is way overweight. He is typically not dining on natural foods. He's eating human foods, or what we call anthropomorphic foods, or is it anthropomorphic or anthropogenic?
You're good either way. I'm proud of you for saying it.
They're eating human provided foods. And so typically black bears, if you look at their weight, they're not that much bigger, especially if they're 200 pounds, or the females at 150, they're not much bigger than humans. And so this is going to dictate some of their behaviors as well. Now, when we switch over to the brown bear, you see their weights going up. Now, this range is tremendous, of 400 to 1,400 pounds. That's a huge weight range. But those male bears, it depends on where in the country you find them to have that variance in their weight, but they can get huge if they get into the right food sources. Female brown bears are typically much smaller than the males. You're looking 300 to 700 pounds on average, but again, a huge weight variation. But you can see they're much bigger than black bears. So they're at least twice the size, if not 3 times the size of black bears sometimes. And then last but not least, we're talking about polar bears, which many people don't believe, but they are amongst the biggest bears in North America, even bigger than the brown bears sometimes. And so you can have weights anywhere from 600 to 1,500 pounds on a polar bear. And again, the females are usually much smaller than the males. So weight-wise, you see the 3 classifications of those animals. Well, how about height? How tall do they get? And we're going to compare them when they're standing on 2 feet, because that's the scary pose that everyone pictures them in. And so if you look at a black bear, if a black bear stands on his back feet, might come in anywhere between 5 to 7 feet tall. So again, it's very human-like. If you have a 6 foot tall black bear and a 6 foot tall man, it's a very comparable comparison. Brown bears, on the other hand, can be much larger, anywhere from 6 foot to 9 foot. Now, if you're an average human being and you have a very large brown bear that stands up and he's 9 foot tall, you can imagine the intimidation factor that thing would have. And then look at that polar bear. They can get anywhere from 7 foot all the way up to 10 foot tall. It's kind of like their physique. They're more lanky than brown bears, but they can be a very, very formidable creature if they stand on their hind two legs. So that describes their physical characteristics. Now let's talk a little bit about their behavior. So diet-wise, black bears primarily omnivorous. When I say, well, they're not primarily, they are omnivorous. They primarily eat vegetation. And it depends on what part of the country you're at, what the local food sources or resources are providing, but most of their diet is going to consist of vegetable matter. They're going to be eating grasses, nuts, and berries. So a lot of vegetable matter makes up a black bear diet. Now, that small percentage that does consist of meat is typically carrion. They'll find a carcass of an animal and eat that. They'll eat a lot of insects. You'll see them raiding larvae from any bee hives that they may find. So they'll eat a lot of insectivorous items. They will kill an animal if they can get their paws on it. The problem is they don't actively hunt. If a black bear is walking around and it stumbles upon a deer fawn, it's obviously going to jump on it. But it's not like they wake up and say, ooh, I'm in the mood for deer today, I'm going to go search. They're opportunistic. They eat whatever they can find. And obviously the easiest thing they can find are the things that don't run away, which are the plant materials. So now when you switch to brown bear, guess what? They're omnivorous too. Diet very similar to the black bear, especially for those brown bears that are found on the interior of the continent. When I say the interior, we're talking away from the coast. So those brown bears or those grizzly bears that are in the Rockies, a huge part of their diet is vegetable matter. Now they'll consume fish, they'll consume elk calves, they'll consume other things very much like a black bear. They are built a little bit differently. They can take down a much larger animal. So if they encounter an adult elk or an adult deer, they can take it down much easier than a black bear could. But they don't actively get up there and focus on, I want to eat meat today. Now, I will tell you, during the springtime, when they emerge, especially in those more northern climates, when they emerge from the den, there's a lot of animals out there that don't survive the winter. And the bears have a powerful nose. They can find those carcasses and consume those meat products. So those bears are eating a lot more meat at that time. But for the most part, they are still omnivorous. They're eating meats and vegetable material. And then last but not least, you have the polar bear. And guess what, folks? The polar bear is the only bear in North America that is carnivorous. That means it survives almost solely on meat. And it's pretty easy to understand that because when you go to the Arctic Circle, there's not much vegetation. And so polar bears are surviving on a diet of seals, walruses, any type of meat that they can get their hands on, they will be consuming that. So polar bears are the only species that are truly carnivorous of the three North American species. Okay, last but not least, we're going to talk about their temperament. Because this is a big defining factor on how you'd behave around these three different species if you were to encounter them. Now, black bears, a good way to describe them, and Stephanie, I'll have you chime in at any time, but I like to say that they're docile and they're kind of wary. And a part of that, it's easy to understand. I describe their physical characteristics, and they're not much bigger than an adult human. Weight-wise or height-wise, a human is a very comparable or a formidable species to a black bear because we're equal in size. And so black bears tend to be really wary of humans. They're skittish. They run from humans in almost every situation. But they're very, is docile a good word, Steph?
Sorry, you caught me off guard there. I don't like docile simply because docile makes them sound like they are not a dangerous animal. They are still a very dangerous animal, and with their population levels, obviously they're going to be one that you could potentially encounter. They prefer to kind of stay to themselves. They don't really want to be around humans, generally speaking. So I think the wary definitely comes into play.
Okay. Well, thank you for adding that. So moving on to the brown bear, a good way to describe their temperament, and I do have to describe this because I say they're aloof and standoffish. And again, let's think about their physical characteristics. These brown bears can be 2 to 3 times the size of a black bear, or the size of a human even. And so when I say they're aloof, it doesn't mean that they're dumb, just walking around not knowing what's going on. It means that they pretty much don't care what's going on. They're the big dog or the big bear on the landscape. So they're not as intimidated by humans. So that's what gives this appearance of them not paying attention, so to speak. Now, when I say they're standoffish, if there is an encounter with a human, they don't back down as readily as black bears do. Now, don't get me wrong, brown bears they don't like being around people, so they usually run off too. But if there's an encounter where the two can't avoid each other, the brown bear is usually much more standoffish because he's much bigger. He's 2 or 3 times bigger than a human. And he's like, why am I backing up? You should be backing up. And so you have to understand their temperament is dictated a lot by their physical characteristics. And last but not least, the polar bear. They're carnivores. They're looking for meat. They're huge. They're big. Don't mess with the polar bear. Now, having said that, polar bears don't like being around humans. They don't see humans as a food source typically, but they would probably be one of the quicker to recognize a human as a food source, especially if food has been really, really scarce. So it's real easy to understand their behavior or their temperament based on their physical characteristics. So moving on, I am hoping, beyond hope, that most of you will be in more and more of my wildlife classes because I teach a lot of bear classes. And I go into this big discussion about the nose, the glorious nose, and I have a demonstration on how powerful a bear nose is. I will not go into that for today's discussion. I'll spare you with that, but I will tell you, you will be rewarded if you want to hear that on different presentations. In fact, my next presentation on bears will definitely talk about how powerful a bear nose is. Having said that, their nose is pretty dang powerful. They can smell things a long, long, long ways away, and it is believed in the mammal kingdom that bears have some of the most powerful noses out there. And if you look at their skeletal structure, the interior lining of their nose, all the different passages and how cram-packed they are with sensory receptors or olfactory receptors, you'll understand why their nose is so powerful. The nose is another thing that helps dictate their behavior, but I'll go into that in a whole different bear presentation about how their nose often drives their behaviors. And last but not least, one thing I will mention, and again, I do have a whole separate online class for this. Bears, as most people I hope know, they hibernate. There's usually no argument. The brown bears and black bears, believe it or not, polar bears are the bear that hibernates the least because they're often in search of food on that Arctic, in that Arctic area. And so they're wandering the ice sheets quite a bit. Females will crawl into a den to give birth. But if you're looking at brown bears and black bears, most people understand bears hibernate. I don't know why it is. Well, I know exactly why it is, but there's some people that believe black bears don't hibernate, or they don't hibernate in different parts of the country. And it all goes back to some biologists trying to sound more smarter than they ought to have been. And they've confused people with describing the process in which black bears hibernate, because they use this process called torpor, which is a light form of hibernation. And they misguided some people by saying black bears don't hibernate. And they ended the sentence there when they should have said black bears don't hibernate like other hibernating animals. They use torpor. So anyway, just understand that bears hibernate in these wonderful fashions. We have a whole presentation called Super Sleepers. I think Stephanie even taught one of those classes once. But it goes into all the different mechanisms and different processes that their body goes through in order to survive these long periods without food or water, for that matter. And so they'll go into a den and spend anywhere from a few weeks to maybe even 5 or 6 months, depending on their geographic area. Now understand, when they're sleeping or when they're hibernating, bears, the one difference with bears is their body temperature does not decrease as drastically, so they can wake up easier. And so if they're seen out and about in the middle of the winter, doesn't mean that they've been up the whole winter. They just woke up and might be walking around. So anyway, they're often called super sleepers, and that is what they are. Okay, won't go into too many details about talking about black bears individually. If you plan on attending a lot of the Wildlife for You classes, black bears are our main focus. So you're going to get your share of black bear discussion. I will show this slide. I think black bears are wonderful. One of the most fascinating aspects of black bears is their color variation. Even though they are called black bears, they can be black, brown, blonde, red, white, or blue. And so they are the all-American bear with that red, white, or blue. Anyway, they're wonderful creatures. There's certain traits that can identify them as black bears as opposed to brown bears. In fact, I'll go into that next. But I'm not going to talk about black bears too much because, like I said, if you're going to participate in Wildlife for You classes, you're going to get sick of me talking about black bears. And as Stephanie can attest, I also talk about them on our podcast every once in a while. Okay, I will talk a little bit more about brown bears. Now, the first thing I want to do is talk about what I just mentioned. One of the differences between what makes a black bear and what makes it a brown bear or a grizzly bear. And so there's a couple of things to look at. There's probably four characteristics that you should look at, and you have to take all of them into account, because I might say, oh, look for a hump on their shoulder. And the problem is you could have a black bear that's climbing up over a log and it looks like he's got a big hump on his shoulder. Or vice versa. You could have a brown bear or a grizzly bear that is in a depression and it doesn't look like he has a hump on his shoulder. So you want to look for all of these characteristics. The first one I'll talk about is that hump on the shoulder. Typically, brown bears or grizzly bears have a very pronounced shoulder. You can see, oh, I could use my mouse here, but you can see this large shoulder area, this hump that's protruding, very definitive of brown bears. Black bears tend not to have as pronounced of a hump, but again, that could be tricky in some situations. Another thing to look for is the ears. I'm not even going to talk much about the ears. Some people say there's tremendous difference between the ears between black bears and grizzlies. I don't see it that much. I will tell you, young black bears tend to have very pronounced, big looking ears. And so you can look at that, especially if it's a young bear. If it has really big ears, it tends to be a black bear. But one of the other really good defining characteristics, the other two, are the profile of the face. If you look at the black bear, you can see, and what I'm drawing here with my mouse is from the top of the head all the way to the nose, it's relatively straight. It's not perfectly straight, but it's pretty smooth and no big humps in it. Now, if you look at the brown bear, and this isn't the best picture for the profile of the brown bear, but its face, there's going to be a big hump. You're going to see a very pronounced brow ridge. And so it's more dish shaped. So comes off the forehead, then goes down where the eyes are, and then comes out the snout. So if you can see my hand, oh, I did that too much. It'll go like that. So a very pronounced dish-faced profile for the brown bear. And then probably one of the, oops, I went too far. One of the most defining characteristics between black bears and brown bears are the claws. The problem is, in most situations, you're not going to be close enough to see the claws, or if they're standing in grass, you can't see the claws. When they're climbing up a tree chasing you, you might be able to see it, but you don't want to get in that predicament.
And in addition, Daryl mentioned how it face on with the dish profile, not a whole lot of help. You have to look at a profile view. Daryl, are you going to do that class where you do the identification and you quiz people? Because that is phenomenal, because so many people get fooled.
Yes. We have a number of classes. I've only set the schedule for the first 6 months of this year, but we teach a class called Brown versus Black. And it goes through these differences. We spend an hour talking about the differences. And I promise you folks, if you take that class, there will be some photos of bears where you're like, that is a black bear, or that is a brown bear. And I can almost guarantee you're going to be wrong. And I'll have a series of photos to show you why you're wrong. And so it's a really good class if you do want to take that one. But going back to that last characteristic, the claws on a black bear, they're usually very short and curved, and they're usually black. And if you look at the claws on a brown bear or a grizzly, they're much, much longer. We're talking 3-inch, sometimes 4-inch long claws, and they're usually whitish. They're very light colored claws. Two very different functions. The black bear is an expert tree climber, and that's why those short, oh, very good, Steph. Thanks for showing that. That is a black bear claw, and they're very adept at climbing trees. In fact, a black bear can climb a tree faster than you can fall out of one. So don't try climbing a tree to get away from a black bear. Grizzlies, their claws are designed more for digging. They're usually flipping over rocks, looking for grubs, or they're digging up clamshells on the coast. They're designed for digging. So they're a much longer tool to use, therefore not making the grizzly or the brown bear a very good tree climber. Now, having said that, young grizzlies can climb trees, or if the tree has a lot of branches, making a very nice ladder for the bear, they can climb there too. But grizzlies tend not to climb trees. Okay. So that's the difference between those two. Now, the one thing I did want to mention, and I told you I'd explain it a little bit more. I keep switching between brown bear and grizzly. And here I'm going to explain the difference between the two. This here is what we would call a grizzly. Scientific name is Ursus arctos. Here is what most people would call a brown bear. Some people would call it a Kodiak bear, but guess what this scientific name is? It's Ursus arctos. They are the exact same species. The thing that is different, they are different varieties or subspecies. And if you've known me or been in my classes long enough, you know my ire for subspecies. I think subspecies are great, but they're so confusing to the public, especially when scientists use them. They throw them out and don't explain themselves too well. And again, this is our fault within our profession, is sometimes we don't clarify things too well. So if you look at the bear on the left, that subspecies or that variety is what we call Ursus arctos, the variety horribilis. And so that is one subspecies. The one on the right is Ursus arctos middendorfi. It's a different subspecies. Generally speaking, folks, when there are subspecies, it means there's slight differences within a species. And generally those slight differences are the result of geographic separation. And so the different subspecies or the different varieties, the one on the left, you have to understand those are grizzlies. Those are living in the Rocky Mountains and the interior part of the continent. And so they are mostly eating vegetation. They're eating berries, they're eating nuts, they're eating the insects. They're not eating a super nutritious diet, so they only grow to be a certain size. So a big grizzly is usually about 600 pounds. That same bear, that same brown bear that is on the coast, they have an unbelievable access to foods, especially when there's a good salmon run. And this is what you see on National Geographic and the Discovery Channel. You see these brown bears feeding and gorging themselves on literally thousands and thousands of pounds of salmon or other fish that are swimming upstream. So that huge food resource allows them to grow huge. And so when you hear of brown bears getting to be 1,200 pounds, 1,400 pounds, same bear as the interior one, but they have a food source that allows them to grow much larger. So that's the difference between the different varieties or the different subspecies of the brown bears. Got it?
An easy way to kind of think about it is if you think about dog breeds, for example, I have an Anatolian Shepherd. He weighs 165 pounds, but his scientific name, Daryl, is Canis
lupus domesticus or Canis domesticus.
Yes. So, and then Daryl has a black lab, also still a dog. The difference here again is one, they're both dogs. We all know that they're both dogs. One is an Anatolian Shepherd. He's big and fat. And then one is a black lab. It's for dogs.
Big and fat,
she's working on it. She's trying, but so it's the with dogs we call them breeds because we have done that specifically as humans to make them certain breeds. We have genetically modified organisms every time we look at our breeded dogs. With bears, instead of calling them breeds, they're varieties, they're subspecies. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, that definitely helps. So again, just understand that, in fact, I usually have a saying that every grizzly is a brown bear, but not every brown bear is a grizzly.
I'm going to interrupt, Siri. We have a question in chat that I think is really good.
Okay, please do.
So Jan was asking, are they different genetically or is it a phenotype? So are they phenotypically different, which means that you can see a difference with your eyes, but genetically they're still the same? Or are they genotypic, which means that their actual genes are different? So in this case, it's all phenotypic. And we know that because if you take either one of these two bears and you put on some great Barry Manilow music or Barry White music or something that they really like, the two of them can successfully breed and create offspring that can still breed. So we know that these guys are true and they're genetically the same bears. The interesting part, and Daryl, I'm going to let you go on this, and if I'm getting ahead of myself, you say it, is when you throw polar bears into this mix, because polar bears used to be brown bears. And then they distanced themselves. They started to change because they lived in obviously a snowier, whiter climate. So the ones that were lighter in color and started to lose some of that dark pigmentation, they actually were more successful in staying alive because they had a lot more stealthy cover. So that's what ended up becoming their common trait. In the right circumstance, you can actually still have a polar bear and a grizzly, a brown bear. They can actually breed. Now, the offspring isn't always viable, but they are still genetically so close that they can successfully breed.
Excellent description there. And I should have jumped in right at the very beginning, but I was just looking at the question now. When Jen asked the difference between whether or not it is a phenotype or a genotype, that when we're talking about phenotype, that's kind of like physical characteristics. And then when we're talking about genotype, that's kind of like the makeup of their genes. And that's the difference between the two. So the grizzly on the interior of the continent is phenotypically, physical characteristics different than the brown bear on the coast, but genetically they're the same animal. So very, very good description there, Steph. Excellent question, Jan. Thank you for that. Okay, moving on. That's all we'll talk about brown bears. I've got a lot of different brown bear talks that we can get into later on in the year. So moving on, last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about polar bears. And one of the coolest things, I got to start off with our polar bear discussion, is asking you, I won't turn on anyone's microphone, but what color are polar bears? Because it seems so obvious that polar bears are white. Duh, who wouldn't know that? And the thing is, they're not white. What they are, if you put their hairs under a microscope, their hairs are actually translucent. They're literally clear. And it's almost like they have these glass filaments on it. Because of the way the sunlight reflects through them and everything, they appear white to our eyes, but their hair is very translucent. Another interesting fact, Steph, do you know what color their skin is?
I do, Daryl. Thanks for asking. Their skin is actually black, which does because of the translucent fur that helps them absorb some what heat that they can get in that geographic area. They get that from the sunlight.
Yes, very good. And because of that black skin and their ability to absorb that heat, it helps keep them warm. And so I think it's fascinating that most people outside of the brilliant students of Wildlife for You, most people would say, oh, polar bears are white. They're actually clear. And I was looking at the chat, most of you knew that. So that's fantastic. But it's just this amazing evolutionary adaptation. So habitat, we did talk, if you looked at that range map, they're living primarily north of that Arctic Circle. They hunt a lot on that ice sheet. Obviously, global warming is definitely having an impact on them with the melting ice sheets. They're finding it harder. And if you're following up with the news, there's more and more polar bears coming down into Churchill, Canada, some of the developed areas in that far north part of Canada. And so they are finding themselves on land more often than they used to be. But we're going to keep an eye on that. I don't know what's going to happen with them, but they definitely prefer to be on that ice sheet because that helps with their diet, what the things are eating or what the polar bears are eating. Now, I will tell you, polar bears are probably one of the coolest animals in the fact that they are super swimmers. And when I say they're super swimmers, if you just look at that body design. And one of the things that if you take a harder look at it, that bear has this torpedo shape. So when it's swimming through the water, it has this physical characteristic that allows them to swim really, really fast. They have these huge partially webbed feet, this torpedo design. They also have this layer of fat that allows them to obviously be in super, super cold water. And Steph, I think I asked you to kind of talk a little bit about how good of a swimmer they are. They're pretty quick, aren't they?
Yeah. So a bear can swim on average, the polar bear can swim faster than Michael Phelps on his best day. So unless you consider yourself better than Michael Phelps, who obviously, if you guys don't know, is an Olympic winner on speed swimming, then don't try to outswim a polar bear. And not only can they swim faster than you, but unless you are some sort of superhuman, they are very well documented for swimming in excess of like 30 miles in a jaunt. I think that's what I remember. Is it 30 miles in a jaunt?
Yeah. There was a study that they had a number of polar bears collared. And I think about a third of the polar bears that they have collared, 30-mile swims was par for the course. And so that distance is incredible. And I think if I'm not mistaken, there's some polar bears that were documented going close to 100-mile swims. That's insane, folks. So I consider polar bears to be almost as much of a marine animal as a land animal. They go on land. A lot of times their solid surface there is that pack ice, but they're truly, truly adept at being in water. So thanks for chiming in on that. So because of where they live, remember they're on that ice sheet, they're in that Arctic area. Understand, although it looks desolate, it's desolate in the fact that vegetation is pretty much what is lacking. Now, if you've ever watched the Discovery Channel or Oh, a lot of those nature shows, when you go underneath, those divers go underneath that sea ice, and there's abundant life, whether or not it's krill or whales or fish or penguin. Well, not penguins in the Arctic, but there is a tremendous amount of life even in those cold, cold, cold waters. That's why polar bears are able to survive where they can survive, by having this carnivorous diet, by eating other animals, because there's abundant life forms even in that Arctic area. It's primarily in that water. And so the bear's diet, the polar bear's diet, is primarily going to be seals, walruses. They'll feed on whale carcasses. They'll feed on anything that they could find. And the thing is, they're really adept hunters. If you're living in an environment that's covered in ice and snow, and you, even though your hair is not white and you look like you're white, you can hide very easily in that environment. But oftentimes what those polar bears do is they lay in wait on that ice sheet. They find these breathing holes where animals, these Arctic mammals, such as those seals and those walruses, they've got to come up for air. And if you're the only, if you're sitting at that only breathing hole available for a mile or two, it won't be long before a seal pops his head up, and that's usually when the bear pounces. And so they're very adept at hunting on that Arctic sea ice, and that's why they're so dependent on that sea ice, because that's pretty much how they evolved their hunting tactics.
And in addition to that, the torpedo shape that you mentioned is perfect for that tactic that you also just mentioned, because they have an extraordinarily elongated neck. And obviously, they've got the more narrow head, the smaller ears, perfect too. If that seal pops its head up and it sees the bear coming and the seal pops down, the bear has a lot of leeway there that it can actually really quickly get into that hole and grab that animal. And I think we had a question on how long they can hold their breath. I believe that the answer for that is 2 minutes.
Yeah, I was gonna say I didn't know the exact time. I don't know, Steph, if you could look that up real quick.
I already did. It's 2 minutes.
Okay, well, because
did not know that off the top of my head. I had to glance.
That was pretty good. You should have took credit for just knowing that off the top of your head. What I was going to say is polar bears are not like those marine mammals like the seals and walrus that are designed to stay underwater for 10 minutes at a time. Polar bears breathe a lot more often than those marine mammals do, but they can hold their breath probably much longer than us. But they're not designed to stay underwater for extended periods. So 2 minutes is a good answer to me. So thanks for looking that up. Okay, I think it's about time. I'm going to quiz you one quick question before we wrap this presentation up. So looking at this picture right here, I'm going to ask you, which one is the male? Because I know which one I would be if I was those three bears there. So that's just a funny question. I have no idea if any of which ones are males or females, but that's the typical male pose in my household. So with that, folks, I will tell you that those are the three bears that live and do quite well in North America. Let's make sure they continue to do quite well in North America. I know most of my followers are bear lovers. I will entertain questions, but let me get through this for the recording's sake. But that's the end of this presentation. Thanks for sitting in, and I will stay and answer questions as long as you want. So start thinking of questions you may have. I do have to give photo credits. A lot of folks contributed photos to this presentation. Those are the folks that have done so, and I really, really thank them. They help make my presentations worthwhile. This was a repeat to make sure we have it on recording, that you abide by the rules and understand that we teach wildlife safety, and wildlife are unpredictable. So just attending this class, just understand that animals could do some things that we don't expect them to do. So I want to add that in there so we have that recorded. And I will tell you, most of you know where to find us. We do have this Wildlife for You webpage that will be updated. I've been pestering Stephanie for I don't know how long. Once her life settles down, hopefully we'll get an update there soon. If you've never listened to it, we started a podcast that has been so much fun to do, and we do plan on continuing those, probably not at the rate that we did this past year. But if you never listened to the Wildlife for You podcast, Steph, your spiel on where to find this is great. So do that if you don't mind.
So yeah, if you'd like to find the Wildlife for You podcast, we're accessible on all of the major popular platforms. So just do a search for Wildlife for You, whether you listen on Spotify, Google Cast, Podbean, Apple Cast, you name it. So Wildlife for You is where you can find us on all of those.
Thank you. And as most of you know, and I think most follow along, our presence is mostly on Facebook. I haven't been posting as much as I used to, but with the classes starting again, please follow along the Wildlife for You Facebook page, because that's where I give updates on classes. Now, I do have, we have classes scheduled for the first and third Tuesday of every month. Those will happen no matter what. My hope is to have some surprise classes, whether or not we get a guest speaker jumping in. So make sure you follow along on that Facebook page, because that's where we'll probably announce that. And just so you know, mark your calendars 2 weeks from today, which will be the third Tuesday of the month. I'm going to be teaching probably the most popular class we have. It's called The Language of Bears. I will be switching up some of the slides. We'll also be showing some video. So I know most of you have seen that, but I encourage you to see it again, because there's always new information we're trying to present, or new videos that we find. And so that's what we'll be doing on Tuesday, January 18th. So with that, I will tell you, it is a complete joy to teach you. These are a bunch of the classes we've taught over the last 4 years at Wildlife for You. And remember, folks, when it comes to wildlife, it's your knowledge that often means their existence. So with that, I will take whatever questions you may have.
There is a great question that I actually want to bring up, because it's a good talking point. So we had a question from Kat asking if it's true that male bears will sometimes kill cubs, and obviously the why. She did specifically say brown bears. So let's talk about all of the three species though.
Do you want to take that, or you want me to?
I told her I was gonna get you started on this one, because this is one of your good talks. So
Kat, you heard correctly. Male brown bears will kill and eat other brown bear cubs. Having said that, as Stephanie was alluding to, it's not just the brown bear trait, it is a bear trait. Black bears will do it as well as polar bears. And so if you look at cub mortality, and it's not a great thing to talk about, no one likes talking about that situation, but these classes talk about what happens in nature. And we're not going to go into gruesome stuff, but we are going to tell you like it is. When it comes to cub mortality, it doesn't matter if it's black bear, brown bear, polar bear, outside of humans often, the number one leading cause of natural cub mortality is oftentimes from other male bears of that same species. Now, I shouldn't say it's the number one cause, because obviously starvation and some other things play a factor into there, but male bears are a huge threat to cubs. And this is why mother bears tend to be very, very protective. We all know you don't want to get close to a mother with cubs, because she will defend those cubs. A lot of that behavior is born out of the fact that she's defending them not just from humans, she's defending them from other bears, especially those male bears. We had a situation in the Smokies one time with, unfortunately, a cub was killed by a male bear. And it actually inspired, if you ever saw my class, it's called A Cub's Life. It was inspired by that event, because if you followed the Great Smoky Mountain National Facebook page, people were up in arms. They were mad at the park rangers about, why didn't you save that cub? Why didn't you do it? And there's this big disconnect about what happens in a cub's life that I think too many people are familiar with Disney and want to believe the Disney side of things. And unfortunately, that's not how nature works most of the time. So anyway, with that, Steph, what else would you like to add to that?
So no, that was pretty much it. I think that you hit it on the spot. With we have to understand that these are, while we consider them unfortunate incidents because that is the way we are wired to feel, this is natural. It is something that happens in nature. It's, it's, again, we would say that that is an unfortunate event, but it is a natural event.
Yes. And I'm kind of looking at some of the chat stuff now. Stephanie, I do want to thank you for sitting in. I asked Stephanie, she can teach class on her own if she wants. She volunteered to serve as a backup today. With me being first time Zoom in today, I was really worried about not being able to operate something. And so I asked Stephanie to sit in. I hope to ask her on many other talks, but she's quite capable of leading her own class if she wanted to, but I very much appreciate you sitting in to help me tonight, Steph.
Absolutely, my pleasure, sir.
Were there any other questions that we had to address?
Nope. I did have one question. I think it was Cammy that asked. She asked what a lot of times those collars, they look really big and clunky. And so she was asking about the average weight. And I said that kind of varies a little because you've got different makes, models, and ages. They do have to be robust to be able to survive the life that they have been given as being strapped to a wild animal's neck for a period of time, but generally speaking, under a couple of pounds.
Yeah, and you have to understand the big bulky collars, the reason they're bulky is primarily battery. When you put a collar on a bear, you want it to last a couple of years. And so it's got to be a stout battery. That's what causes the bulk in those bears. Now, bears, you have to understand, are one of the bigger animals that we work with. And so they can handle a bigger collar. If you're trying to put a radio collar on a more petite animal, you're losing battery life. And so, believe it or not, there's tracking devices that we can affix to bats and little tiny animals, but they'll only last, they'll only last a couple of days. It's all in the design, like Stephanie said, what you want that tracking device to do. So those big bulky collars can collect a lot of data for a long time, but the bears can handle that.
Yeah, they definitely can. And to Daryl's point, a lot of times when you're looking at something like that, battery technology is getting better. So what we see now in the functionality, the size of a collar that we would use nowadays that would last for a couple of years. How long ago, like 30 years ago, Daryl, when we were still using radio telemetry, to get a collar that was functional and reliable for 2 years, I mean, the battery was obviously at that time, it was a lot different because that was before nickel cadmium and lithium ions and all of these other things. So they continue to get better.
Okay, I'm going to jump to a question, Jan. And Jan, I didn't see your original. Pardon?
I'm going to jump out if that's cool.
Okay, Steph, again, thanks for joining. And you go do what you do, and I appreciate you.
Bye, guys.
Jan, I'm going to jump back to your question. I didn't see your original question regarding the low temps black bears can tolerate, but I think I understand that. They can survive. Now, understand when a black bear is hibernating, or any bear is hibernating, they are usually deep underground, or they're usually in a confined space. And so that confined space combined with their body heat is going to keep that area heated. So their den is typically not getting down to sub-freezing temperatures for extended periods of time. And so if you were to have a bear that was exposed to those extremely cold, they're not going to do well. But because of the fact that they're inside a den, they can survive quite well. Now, you have to understand, they also have a tremendous layer of fat on them. They have their fur. And so they are very, very adept at surviving cold temperatures, partly because of their hibernating behavior. They're able to crawl into those dens, conserve heat, conserve energy, and last a long time. You also asked a question about, has anything been done with microchips for bears and elk? And you can put a microchip on any animal that you want. The thing with microchips is they're not tracking devices, they're identification devices. And so when you insert a microchip into an animal, unless you scan that animal with with that other instrument that detects the microchip, you would have no idea it's there. So we can put microchips in any animals that we want. We just have to know to scan that animal. And with wild animals, a wild animal comes in, gets hit by a car, whatever happens, oftentimes you don't know to scan that animal. So microchips do have a place for maybe some endangered species, something like that, but typically we're not putting microchips in because we can just as easily put in a tag of some sort, just so we know that animal has been marked. Cami asked a question, why are some of the ear tags so big? They look like they'd snag on underbrush. I agree with you, Cami. Sometimes it depends on what agency is putting on the tag. It also depends on what the study is. Now, typically you don't want a very big ear tag. So most tags, believe it or not, Cami, are fairly discreet. You can't see them from too far away. However, there are some bears that were marked with bigger tags, and that is to identify that bear more easily, so that you can see the number on it. And a lot of times there have been studies designed where they use trail cameras to take pictures of the animals, and they have to be able to read the tag. So that's why the tags tend to get bigger depending on what particular research is taking place. For the most part, I agree with you. I would rather see a bear without a collar, without an ear tag. But the fact that we're collecting some information, I think it's a small price to pay. Hopefully we'll get to the point where we have to tag and collar less and less, but until we know as much as we can know, those studies will still take place. All right. Well, okay, another question by Jan. Are ear tags or our tags, are the colors indicative of something? And that's a misconception that's out there. Some people will say, oh, a red tag means it's on death row and yellow tag means this. Usually the difference between the colors is a different agency, or it just so happens to be that was the color that they ordered for that research project. So there is no color code information that any specific agency uses. Now, there might be a research project that might have specific colors that they use, but for the most part, if you're out there, no matter where you would be, if you see a bear with a color on it, it would be next to impossible to know if that color represents anything unless you know what studies are being done. But in most situations, it's just a tag that they had available. All right. If nobody else has any other questions, I've kept you here for about 90 minutes, which is what we promised. I thank you for sitting in and bearing with us as we worked out a couple of the kinks. Hopefully these Zoom presentations will go much smoother, but I think it went over fairly well, and you guys are awesome. This is why we do these presentations. We want you to learn as much as you can possibly learn. So thank you, folks. And with that, I believe we will stop the recording and I will sign out and bid you a good night. And hopefully we'll see you in 2 more weeks. So you guys are awesome, folks, and I appreciate everything.